Good day, fellow champions of inclusion. I am AAron, and this is the Inclusive Dad podcast, where we explore inclusion and make it practical. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join me in exploring ways we can create a more inclusive world together. You are important, you matter, and you can make a difference. Today, my guest is Amar Peterman. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Really. Why don't you just start us off by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Uh, I am a public scholar and theologian. I work primarily at the intersection of religion and public life. My work draws from the deep wells of the Christian tradition, but is also meant to be accessible and hopefully helpful to folks who draw from different wells of wisdom and spirituality, ethics, notions of the common good. I'm also a PhD student at the University of Chicago, and my project there focuses primarily on how people who believe the same things about God then use those beliefs in radically different ways and even against one another. And then last, I am the author of a new book called Becoming Neighbors that comes out on March 12th. In it, I offer a deeply local vision of the common good that is rooted in the practice of neighbor love that, again, draws from the Christian scriptures, but many other traditions have their own language to describe, I think, the same exact work of um, cultivating a truly common good with and for the people who live around you.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I didn't tell you this part, but I have a tattoo on my arm that says "Love thy neighbor." So I
Perfect.
just so perfect. Yeah, I'm like, this is a
Amazing.
yeah. I mean, for me, it's just like talked off before we started recording. I grew up Baptist, and just lots of. I mean, I still can. If I go to church where they play the old hymns, I can sing them without looking at the hymnals. I went to church that much, so. But to me, I feel like if we actually loved our neighbor like we're supposed to, I mean, there'd be a lot less issues, a lot, the world would be a much better place. So I have it for a reminder for that for sure. But let's start off. What is your definition of inclusion?
The first thing that comes to mind is genuine accessibility, not only physical accessibility, but cultivating spaces that consider who might join. In the book, I use this illustration of the table to describe the common good that the common good is not found, as if we could build the right ideological spaceship to go capture it and bring it back and implement it, but instead it's cultivated with the people around us. And to do that, we have to join together. And I propose this vision of the shared table where people across lines of difference join together and work towards what might be truly good for everyone present. But within that is has to be a consideration of how do people show up to the table. And this illustration can be extended infinitely. But I think of, if the place where the table is in some rural neighborhood, then how do people who take public transit get there? If it's in a high rise that doesn't have an ADA accessible, elevator,
Hmm.
how do folks who might be in a wheelchair or might be able to use the stairs join? How is someone who may be deaf able to not only understand but actively participate in the conversation so that their needs and desires and hopes for our community might be heard truly? Um, that means that the table has to be an intentional place of inclusion, which means considering what it would mean for others to join. And so there's many ways you could think of inclusion, but for me, the thoughtfulness of what true hospitality looks like is a key part of it.
Yeah, I love that. I had listened to a podcast you were just on where they asked about the title of your book, and you talked about like the definition of like a neighbor and who the neighbor is, and I think what you were talking about was from a guy named Eugene Peterson. Do you want to talk a little bit about like his theory of like the Good Samaritan and who our neighbors are?
Yeah. Uh, Eugene Peterson translates this parable of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10. Jesus asked this question at the end after telling the story of a man beaten and left on the side of the road, and two people who are commonly associated with being pious or religious walk by and don't bother. with the man who was beaten, but the Samaritan who is historically, Samaritans are a community that are deeply at odds with the Jewish community of Jesus' time. And Jesus positions the Samaritan as the protagonist and says, "This is the one who sees the man in need, even though he was not the one who hurt him or caused him harm, feels the holy obligation to care for him and to set aside what he's doing and help this man along his journey." Uh, the way that Peterson translates Jesus' question at the end, um, is not who was a neighbor to the man in need, but who became a neighbor to the man in need, which is, in my reading, a way of treating neighborliness or the status of being neighbors as something that we live into, that is cultivated and developed, not something that, there's the positional, the person who lives across the street from me is my neighbor. By geography, by location, by proximity, we are neighbors. Uh, there's also a way in which I have to live into being a neighbor, becoming a neighbor to the people around me. And I think that's what this parable, that's so often used and cited, perhaps too much, is trying to get at, is that the Samaritan is not simply a neighbor because he's in proximity to the man in need, but because he actively helps him. He joins in community with him. And so that's the call of the book, is to say we ought to become neighbors to those around us and not simply assume, well, because we live close to each other, we'll figure it out. There'll be some sort of good that's cultivated or created through this. Um, I think we actually have to do the hard work. And this is preaching to myself. We have to do the hard work of walking across the street or across the hallway, knocking on our neighbor's door and getting to know them and trying to cultivate or think through what might be a shared good between the two of us. Because if we can't do that, then what are we doing proposing notions of the common good for our entire country or the entire world if our own neighbors can't agree on what might be a shared good for just the people around us?
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. It makes a lot of sense because yeah, I'm looking out my window and there's houses, they're my neighbors, but well, one of them I've actually talked to the person, the other ones I haven't talked to it. So I mean, technically they are my neighbor, but yeah, we're not. I'm not being neighborly. I don't know anything about them besides what I've seen through the windows, which is interesting because I mean, growing up, I mean, we were much more. I knew my neighbors much more. Like my mom needed sugar, but I'd go to then she'd run over to Grandma Emily's house and grab a cup of sugar and that kind of stuff. And now it seems like we're so far away from that. You go to your house, come home, don't talk to people. It's interesting, but yeah, it's definitely yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's something about that too, and that I had the same experience, and we all had our landlines, and you'd call, hang
Mhm.
out with my neighbor down the road, and his mom would pick up and go, "Oh, is so and so home?" And
Yeah,
uh, yeah, I remember when I first, as a child, moved into the house that I spent most of my life in, and it was closer to the winter, and my mom dressed me up in my snow pants and said, "There's two kids like over in their yard going down this little hill that's there. Go grab your sled and join them." And those ended up being close friends for my entire childhood, and we all went to the same school.
yeah,
Um, and yeah, the paradox of the greater ways in which we are technically connected to one another, and the paradox of that with our disconnection and our reluctance to know or to be with our neighbors, even when seemingly communicating or joining with them would be the easiest it's ever been.
yeah, for sure. Yeah, but yeah, that is also a great point. Yeah, we're more connected via devices than we ever have been, but yeah, we've lost like the face to face, those close connections. Yeah, it's interesting. Um, so yeah, for me growing up, I grew up in small town, southern Minnesota. I was thinking, so this is interesting. I was thinking this morning, and I went to a private school, Christian school, kindergarten through eighth grade. So we had like 8 kids, I think, in my grade. One of them, she was adopted. And I was thinking this morning, and I was like, I don't ever remember hearing. like where she was adopted from, like the circumstances. Now I don't know if that is just because I forgot that we talked about it and not the details of it, or if we just literally never talked about it. So, and then the only other time I saw somebody that didn't look like me, we have some fields like vegetable fields, so the migrants would come into town in the fall for harvest. Otherwise, before I went to high school, I don't remember seeing anybody that didn't look like me. Went to a Baptist church every time the door was open, so my world was super small. I think we had one African American family in high school, so just not a lot of diversity. So just it's been interesting looking back, and I don't remember anything about disability. So we talked a little bit beforehand. My dad had polio and some other family members, but it was at I didn't we never talked about use the word disability, didn't talk about anything like that at all growing up. So my daughter Cecilia was born 23 years ago. She had found out she was having seizures, and now she uses a power wheelchair to get around and stuff. So just had to learn all of it. So it's been an interesting journey for me, just kind of looking back, reflecting on. I mean, like I didn't. It was my daughter was probably over 10 years old, and all of a sudden I was like, "Well, that's interesting." My dad technically has a disability, but we never ever used the word, never described it that way. So it's interesting. And then growing up Baptist, and then I had a daughter with a quote unquote disability, and then there's verses that are popping in the head like you go to heaven and your body's perfect, but what does that mean about my daughter? Because she's also
Right.
created in God's image. So coming to some of that stuff is like, okay, this is interesting. Like how do you think of those things? So I mean, do you ever get into like the disability theology or how some of those verses work out
Yeah,
for you?
absolutely. I mean, I had to, in a similar way, reckon with them myself. Yeah, I also grew up in a small town just outside Green Bay, Wisconsin, called Pulaski, which from that name you can imagine it's a Polish Catholic community. And so I went to school there, and then I went to church in the next town over, um, at a white evangelical megachurch. And so in both spaces, I was clearly the ethnic minority. But to stack on top of that, then I also had a disability, and so I had all of these questions that seemingly didn't have many answers to them, or at least I wasn't finding them. And so I'd read passages, in scripture of disability or healing, and would get, the worst of the worst interpretations thrown at me. Not necessarily by the church leadership, but by people I'd sit next to in the pews, and they'd, whether it was there or in line at Starbucks or the bookstore or wherever else, uh, hopefully well-intending Christians would come over and pray for healing.
Mhm.
And when I was younger and had this very evangelical spiritual fervor, uh, I believed that I could be healed and that it would be, you know, I could play it in my mind to say this would be, this great example of, God's glory and goodness and providence for me. And I could, become these aspirations of this inspirational speaker who was healed, and I could tell everyone about this. Uh, and that never happened. And in fact, when it didn't happen, when people would pray for me and I, say, now try to walk, which I could walk anyways. It's like,
Mhm.
but they would say try to walk, or they'd invoke some sort of, pick up your mat and walk. And again, it's just very over spiritualized, and I would still be disabled. They'd seemingly like get mad at me. And that's where the blame of you don't have enough faith, or
Yep.
you must have some sort of unconfessed sin in your life,
Mhm.
and all these reasons that put the blame of disability on me, as if it's something I've caused for myself. And again, this is couched in an ableist context and also a racialized context, because these are all predominantly white evangelicals
Mhm.
who are doing this to this brown kid who's just trying to order his coffee. And I think what's so powerful about disability theology and the way that disability theologians read the scriptures is that they see disability as the site of God's divine revelation, um, not something to blame, which even, in John 9, the disciples do. They see a man who was born blind and they ask who sinned. Um, with the assumption of someone must have sinned, either this person or his parents, so that he was born blind. And Jesus wholly rejects that assumption and instead turns the occasion of this question into a way to say that no, this man was born blind so that the glory of God might be revealed through him. And I think there's a temptation in the passage to skip over that and go right to the healing, which is this odd, visceral moment where Jesus seemingly spits on the soil beneath him and creates mud, which would require like a lot of saliva, uh, and wipes it
I
on this
never
man's
thought about that
eyes.
part. Yeah.
Uh, it doesn't. It's visceral and it's kind of grotesque, and yet it's this deeply embodied, like a God who has saliva is able to combine that with the earth beneath him, uh, and heal someone. Um, we're really eager to jump to that because of everything happening with it. But I think throughout scripture, not everyone's healed, and there are plenty of people with disability, various kinds of disabilities in the scriptures and in Jesus' time, and they're not healed. They encounter Jesus or they're in proximity to him, and they have to go on living with whatever disability they have. And so I don't think the scriptures are teaching that the ultimate end is healing in a physical form. I think what we get instead is Jesus proclaiming a new kingdom that is radically inclusive, that is radically hospitable, and that welcomes everyone to the table. Uh, and that is the greater message that I think Jesus is offering. This the pedagogical move is to say the sight of disabled persons is where God teaches us, and reveals God's self to us, not in powers, not in great wealth or these things that we prop up as the greatest forms of success. Instead, Jesus goes to the folks who seemingly are the down and outs, who have nothing going for them, who can't walk, who can't see, who are begging in his time because that's what's available to them. And Jesus says, "This is where I'm going to tell you about who I am." And that's what I think disability theology does so well, and elevates, yeah, in the stories of scripture.
Yeah. Yeah. I had not thought about the volume of spit that would require to create mud. So yeah, that's a new thought now.
It's a lot.
It's all, yeah, there would be a lot. Yeah. And I mean, the interesting part about that story is the disciples asked, what have they parents done wrong that this happened? I mean, there's still people that think that today where, a kid has a disability or somebody has a disability and there's, what did somebody do or what caused this? So, I mean, that's still, those thoughts are still around today. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. How do you think we can use empathy to be more inclusive?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ways. One ties to the hospitality point, which is to say, if you want to create hospitable spaces, you have to consider who's joining you at the table. Uh, And there's a way in which you do that where you Google, what do I need? Like, what compliances do I need to meet? What standards do I need to meet for this to happen? And there's another where you cultivate such an empathy and relationship with others that you go, oh, I know this person's coming and I know that they're allergic to this thing. And so we're not going to
Yeah.
bring it. We're going to make sure that this person can join fully and don't have to worry about this allergy that they have. Uh, or I know this person and they're, in a wheelchair and I have a van that I can use to go bring them here so that they don't have to take public transit and navigate that. Uh, I think empathy tied to relationship is central to inclusion. It's central to cultivating a truly common good. Um, and so there's, especially in Christian spaces, been a demonization of empathy, which makes no sense to me. I there are ways in which I try to be understanding, and empathetic towards people who would disagree, fervently with the things that I believe about who God is and what God's desires are for, um, creation. Um, folks who say that empathy is destructive or toxic or part of this like radical left agenda, like I don't know what Bible you are reading,
Right.
um, because all I see in Scripture is Jesus empathizing in the most truest way, which is to say that God becomes human, that God who sets the throes of causality, the waves of contingency and cause and effect in motion, enters into those waves so that God can be with us, so that God can know us, and so that we can know God. This is I'm speaking out of what I believe in the Christian tradition, um, but that's a radical practice of empathy, and love and self-giving. And what I see in the Christian teachings is that God doesn't do this to gain something for God's self, as if God needs, you know, to merit something that God would put in front of God's self. Uh, I think God comes and does all of this to give everything away. Um, Everything that Jesus merits in his incarnation, his life, his death, his resurrection, his ascension, anything good, eternally or otherwise, that comes from that is for others. And I think that is radical empathy, and radical care and radical selflessness, that we certainly, uh, certainly aspire to in the best ways that we can, even though we will always fall short of that. That's the model. That's the example. The that is the farthest thing from toxicity. It's radical inclusion, it's radical love, it's radical care, it's a radical decentering of yourself to pay
Absolutely.
attention to those around you. And I believe that once we begin doing that, we will find God in the most unlikely of places. So that's yeah, I think those are deeply tied together.
Mhm. You talked about like the empathy and how it's been demonized, even in like Christianity. I mean, the word inclusion is the same way. Like people that
Hmm.
I have gone to church with, and they're like all of a sudden on the bandwagon about diversity, equity, inclusion, like being bad. And I'm like, I don't. Then they start describing it, and I was like, okay, so what you're talking about as an inclusion isn't. That's not really what it means. You're just going along with what the narrative is. That's not even.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's interesting how these words that I mean, I also have the word inclusion tattooed on my arm. So like, and I talk about inclusion, call myself the inclusive dad, and then like not too long ago, all of a sudden it's a bad word, and I was like, how that? I'm like, okay, this is how are we making this a bad word? Like we want.
Right.
So it's just it's been interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's the social, like, co-opting of language
Yes.
too. Um, and that inclusion doesn't mean what it has always or often meant in our
Yeah.
colloquial context. Now it's being co-opted to mean something different that then can then be demonized and seen as like, "Oh, look what these people who say inclusion are doing." Uh, yeah, that's a whole nother conversation of the work
Yeah.
that language does in particular contexts and how it can
Yeah.
shift and change, but, we'll save that for another day.
Absolutely. I think on the podcast I was watching too, you talked a lot about, or you talked a little bit earlier on when we were recording here about the table and inviting people with different views and stuff to the table. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, I live in a super small town, middle of southern Minnesota. And how do you, if I'm trying to look for like a space, to meet others with different views than me, different religions, different, ethnicities, do you have like tips on where to find that in spaces such as mine where I'm out in like rural, not a lot of s- ton of diversity right close to me?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think different forms of diversity are all around us, when we start looking for it. It's at the grocery store, um, it's at the local food pantry, it's at the playground, where kids are hanging out with each other, like we were talking about earlier, and,
Right.
uh, yeah, I think those are all spaces that have, sometimes literal, wire, picnic tables, um, and often this work for me, it's challenging as someone who's more introverted, who's, the
Mhm.
neighbor who likely, am walking my dog with my headphones in and my head down and maybe give a polite nod and keep moving. Um, to say, to truly know my neighbors means at some point I'm going to have to look up and say, hi, how are you doing? this is who I am. What house do you live at? Which kids of the are yours? I think the finding the table often comes down to a really, for some of us, challenging disposition of creating it in places where people are gathered together. And I think, I forget if it was in that conversation or another, where folks have rightly, and in Minnesota, especially now, felt just the weight of everything happening in our society, in our community, in our government, um, and have said, you know, how do we get out of this? How do I find any sense of hope uh, or desire to join at a table with others? And my encouragement has always been to uh, go volunteer somewhere. And in this practice of decentering yourself, um, sit and serve at a local food pantry, um, and meet people in your community who you don't have to have these long exorbitant conversations with, but say, here you go, here's a plate of food, here's some groceries that you can pick up, help folks who are looking for things. Like, it's very simple human
Mhm.
interactions that, again, in this digital world of parasocial relationships and the sense of connection, when really we're just reading each other's, tweets and threads and Instagram posts and all of these things, which can be good, to actually look someone in the eyes and, again, not have to have these long drawn out, so what is your vision of the common good, or what is your deepest
Mhm.
desire for our community right now? uh but to have these little human interactions, I think, can be so life-giving. And so, yeah, I think my encouragement is always to, even in the smallest ways, cultivate more human interaction with the people around you, which in itself is a risk. There are terrible, bad people in our neighborhoods, in our community, in our society. Uh, but I have to believe that for all those bad people who might be there, there's a lot of people who truly are trying to find relationships, even at a very basic level, connection, a smile, something that reminds all of us in this time of deep dehumanization, that we are humans and we do have a desire to care for one another, even in little ways.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great reminder. I mean, as you were talking, I was like realizing, okay, so I just asked him, how do I do it the easy way? And you just reminded me that it's something that takes work. There's not like an easy, here's the table, just go to that table, everybody's going to be there. And I'm like you too, where I mean, I'm probably mostly an introvert, so I don't like, reaching out because maybe they'll reject me or I don't, whatever, have a bad reaction. But I personally know if I have more space in my day or allow myself, yeah, to look up or be aware of what's around me. I mean, you meet great people, you have good conversations. So I mean, I actually, I know it's the right thing to do. It's something still you want it the easy way. Like I don't want to have to like spend hours figuring it out. I just want to show up somewhere and talk to people that are open to it
Right.
already. It's all set up for me. I can just stop in and talk and leave and not have to do more. But yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think at its best, like, this is what places of worship
yeah,
can do. Uh, for as much as I hated the, post church announcements, take 5 minutes and
yeah.
go greet your neighbor. That, again, at its worst, it can be a terrible time, but at its best, those are those exact examples of, you don't know who you're gonna meet, and you have this little 5 minutes to introduce yourself. Gosh, if anyone who went to church with me growing up heard this, they would be like, "This guy doesn't, what's he never he this was the bathroom break time." Uh,
Yeah.
but I think at its best, and it's an important condition, but at its best, this is what places of worship can do so well, by cultivating spaces that are marked by love and generosity and kindness, and then open up space for people to meet one another.
Yeah, and it's interesting how you talk because I mean, I've had just one example. We went to, I think her name is Nadia Boltz-Weber, I think. I don't know if I have it
Mhm.
correct. My girlfriend and I and my dad drove from Minnesota out to Sioux Falls, South Dakota, because she was going around having like events. So we drove out there, and I was like, we were there, and I was like, man, I should choose. You could go up and talk to her. I was like, man, I should go up there because I'm like, we're here. We already drove here. I might as well go say hi and get a picture with her. When am I going to see her again? And I kind of went back and forth while I went up there, and somebody in a wheelchair like pulled in right behind me in line, and then we talked, and I had him on my podcast, and he's a great guy. But it's like just simple things like that. Like if I would have decided like, no, I don't want to get up and out of my seat and make the effort, I would have met her one I mean face to face, wouldn't have met this great person. So it's just, yeah, those little things where you have to step out of your comfort zone, and sometimes it works out really well, and it's fun. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What is one tip you can share to help the listeners be more inclusive today? So just anything, some things everybody can start doing today to be more inclusive.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you can do is listen to the stories of folks who are disabled, who have been marginalized, who have uh, lived in a society that has decreased their accessibility to the world around us. Um, and that can take the form of an in-person conversation. It can take the form of, you have plenty of these folks on your podcast to tell their stories. You mentioned disability theology for folks who want to hear theological or philosophical or ethical, spiritual insights from these folks. The resources abound, but I think one way that we can do this is by listening and not to insert ourselves into the conversation or to say, "Oh, I'm doing the right thing," but simply to take their stories um, in both the joy and pain of them on their own terms, and then from that reflect and think, how can I better understand? How can I better empathize? How can I become a person that when I encounter someone who has a disability, do not have to think, what should I do in this moment? But instead, have cultivated a disposition to say, oh, I know what this, uh, I know how I can help in this moment without being intrusive, without being offensive, or without diminishing or belittling this person. Here's how I can love them. Here's how I can care for them in a way that uplifts and respects their humanity, their dignity. And again, as we talked about earlier, perhaps you might even find God in that moment, or find something divine or sacred in that interaction. And so, yeah, that would be my encouragement to folks.
No, that's great. Where's the best place for everybody to connect with you? And also, where can people pre-order your book?
Yeah, you can pick up the book wherever you like to buy books from your local store. The book is coming out through Erdman's Publishing, and they have it up on their website. You can also do Barnes and Noble, Amazon Bookshop, any of those spaces. An audiobook is also on the way, and so for folks who prefer to read in that format, that should be coming out sometime this year as well. And then I am primarily on Instagram. I'm also attempting TikTok, although I don't know. I'm too old to know how it works. There's too many of these Gen Z kids with dances and trends that I'm just, talking into a microphone and hoping the right people find it. Uh, but yeah, Instagram, TikTok, I've been getting more active on threads as well. And so, yeah, any of the major social media spots you can find me. And then I have a Substack called This Common Life that I also write on pretty regularly.
Ready for the last question? Do you like spam lunch meat? Yes or no?
Yes, I have not had it in a long time, but yes.
So yeah, I live near Austin, Minnesota, where they make spam and where the spam museum's located. So if you ever want to visit the
Mm,
spam museum, you got to come to southern Minnesota.
amazing. Wow, and I'm to go pick up some spam. I have fond memories of it, but I've not picked it up in a long time.
No, yeah. I mean, we only have it probably a couple times a year. We'll slice it up and have it like with pancakes or something. Fry it.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
To those listening, thank you for allowing me to be part of your journey. It is truly an honor. Please join the podcast newsletter by clicking on the link in the episode description to keep up with the latest episodes. Together, we can make the world more inclusive. Until next time, stay empowered and be a champion for inclusion.